All right. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to, I guess, what is kind of a hybrid episode here of Office Hours slash Behind the Sims. I'm joined here with Matt today, and we're going to be talking about our new slider defaults. In case you missed it, over the past week, we've adjusted the slider default values for different contests and slate sizes for all sports as essentially the kind of final product of our big contest simulation and slider backtesting project that we've been working on. If you missed that, or if this is news to you, you're hearing this for the first time, there is a big series on our Behind the Sims playlist on our YouTube channel that basically walks through step by step every part of this process. They are the 7 or so recorded internal meetings that we had as we walked through this, from laying the foundation and the groundwork of how we were going to do some of these contest sims, to looking at the data live on a call and actually setting some of these new values. So the focus here today is to talk about some of the new defaults, talk about kind of the general trends, what we learned from this project, what we think this really means for DFS theory, to talk a little bit about our approach and how we handled this, but also probably most importantly to answer your questions. I know just based on office hours this past 2 days, just Monday and Tuesday this week, there's been a lot of excitement about the new sliders, a lot of questions, a lot of conversations about the DFS theory side of this. So we want to answer your questions. I know there's already about probably a half dozen or so questions for us to get to. And if you have more, fire away at us in the YouTube chat or in the Office Hours channel in Slack. Before we dive in, I know there will be plenty of people that end up listening to this as a part of the Behind the Sims podcast on Spotify or Apple Music or wherever you listen to that show, that didn't get a chance to watch this live. So if you listen to this and you have a question here that we don't get to today, email us, support@sabersim.com. I'd be happy to record another short video or answer some questions that you might have on another future office hours there as well. So we'll go ahead and just start getting into this here in a second. But first of all, Matt, what's going on? Thanks for hopping on today. How's it going?
It's going well. Yeah, I'm excited to get into this. Obviously, it's been. I mean, we started this a couple months ago, and
Yeah.
I feel there's like so much to talk about. So excited to answer questions and probably to ramble on a bit about kind of just nerding out over all of this like DFS theory kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, for sure. We were talking right before we went live, and I think both Matt and I here are really excited for this one, really excited for this discussion here today. I think a good place to start is, again, I mentioned that the Behind the Sims show explains the step-by-step process we took to get to where we ended up at. But Matt, do you want to kind of start by, I guess, just explaining how we ended up picking these new sliders, or by what metric, I guess, did we use to determine what are the best sliders?
Yeah. So this whole Behind the Sims series has talked about kind of getting into the details of the process we took. Long story short is we built this contest sim that basically we tested every single combination of slider settings, tested them across a bunch of different slates and contests, and then we calculated a bunch of metrics for how basically how much you could expect to win with each slider settings. And what we calculated was for the entire pool. So we're not looking at just the top 20 or 150 or whatever by SaberScore. We're looking at the entire lineup pool because the goal of this project was to basically give users the best pool of lineups to choose from. And then kind of that step 3, that process of managing your exposures, choosing, the SaberScore is sort of separate from this. Initially, we were going to just look at okay, what's the top ROI builds, which settings lead to the highest average ROI across your whole build. It turns out that was not the right metric because you end up with just really, really concentrated exposures, really, really low sim precision because it's just concentrating all your exposures to the top plays when really you want a diverse set of lineups. And so with that in mind, we ended up choosing omega ratio primarily as the metric to maximize. So omega ratio is basically a like portfolio optimization metric that maximizes the amount that you win while minimizing the amount that you lose on any given sim. So it's essentially, literally what it is like the amount you win when you win divided by the amount you lose when you lose. And so what it is really doing is giving you lineups that are lower risk, or a pool of lineups, a portfolio of lineups that are lower risk, where if you enter the entire pool in theory into all these contests, you would have some diversity and you would have fewer like losing days, or your losing days would not be losing as much. And so the purpose of that, obviously, you're not playing your entire pool of lineups every time, but the purpose of using that metric is to give you a lineup pool that has upside, because that is still measured by the omega ratio in terms of like how much you win when you win, while having enough diversity to kind of lower your risk of ruin. And as we talked about in the previous Behind the Sims series with Eric, like that's a very important part of DFS, is reducing the chance that you go broke. And so we want to make sure that we are incorporating that into the process here as well. So yeah, omega ratio is essentially what we're maximizing here, though we ended up kind of using a bit of subjectivity in our actual choice of the sliders. So, we have a list of like 1,300 different combinations of the 0 through 10 sliders. And sometimes we made subjective choices about just using kind of based on the patterns that we were seeing, and like how the sliders changed based on contest size and slate size. We wanted to kind of match those patterns a bit. And then just a bit of subjectivity in terms of sometimes maybe we would choose a slightly higher sim precision number than like the optimal, like the highest omega ratio, because we want, I think all else equal, we want to give users more options to choose from. So maybe like using a sim precision of 5 would be the highest omega ratio, but if you use a sim precision of 6 or 7, like you can still get the same upside in your top 150, but you'll have like a more diverse set of lineups to choose from. And so generally we want to lean towards, the, I think, lower risk, higher diversity pools. And then just kind of our intuition a little bit about what makes sense for different contest types, different slate sizes. If we're seeing this pattern and then like there's one slate size where it's like really off, I think want to assume that generally it's going to follow the similar pattern throughout the contest sizes and slate sizes.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and I want to come back as well to some of those thoughts about the way that the lineup pool interacts with the lineup set and how SaberScore fits in there. But I think that a big point here is the idea that we're trying to make the best pool of lineups for people as possible. And I talk about that on office hours a lot, as treating your lineup pool as a subset of what is viable to play in a particular contest or a particular slate, so that you can feel comfortable making changes to that lineup pool to find your lineup set. And that was kind of our intention here, is basically making that assumption accurate.
Right. So like we want every single lineup in the pool to be viable, to be like plus EV. And so that's why, like, I think omega ratio does a good job of that, of like really, if there's a lineup that like is just really, really bad, it's going to hurt, even if it's like diverse, even if it's negatively correlated with the other lineups in your pool, it's probably still going to lower like the omega ratio of like the whole pool, because it's just not winning very often.
And I think this fits in well with our DFS profit plan recommendations of playing pretty large portfolios of unique lineups, because we took kind of a portfolio approach here, a portfolio optimized approach. I think you can feel a little bit more comfortable using a single build and playing it into a large large number of different unique entries, because that the value of diversity and the value of minimizing risk there is already kind of taken into account. But I do want to, before we get too deep into the weeds here, let's talk just kind of a little bit about broad strokes, the changes to the sliders. First of all, they are all up in the app. If you've been playing using SaberSim in the past week or so, for any sport, you've been using the new sliders as they are. But do you want to kind of give just a brief overview about what changed generally here for the sliders?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So first thing I want to point out is that these, if you listen to the last Behind the Sims, you might notice that like some of what you see here, if like we talked about specific like choices that we made, they might not exactly match. Part of this is basically we didn't hard code all of the sliders based on like every combination of slate size and contest size. We essentially what we tried to do is like find patterns that matched closely. In the future, I think we're going to kind of refactor how the sliders work so that they're essentially like we store all this stuff in a database and they're just hard coded in there, and then we can make adjustments. But for right now, we kind of I went with the quicker approach because I wanted to make sure that these changes got in. But like you might see a little bit of tinkering in the future with just like slightly adjusting some of these combinations. But that being said, the summary, I would say, of what changed is correlation for MLB. Correlation went down across the board. So before, I think for bigger slates, it was generally around 8 correlation as the default for most contest types, especially the bigger ones.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's 5 to 6. And for smaller slates, it might be a little bit lower, but yeah, correlation went down like probably 3 to 4 ticks for most contests. Ownership, I think, went down a little bit. It's still at 4 here, so that's decently high, but that, you know, for this is for a bigger contest. But I'd say in general, ownership went down a little bit. Sim precision, I think we stayed pretty close to the same. The other thing is I think the number of games on the slate, so the size of the slate, has a bigger impact on these sliders than the type of contest. So these drop down the entry limit and entrance contest. All we changed is GPP, by the way. Cash is still 000. The entry limit and entrance drop downs, I think, have a lower impact on these sliders than the size of the slate. So you notice, yeah, as you're clicking around, you know, that changes a little bit based on what you're choosing here, but it's not huge changes. Whereas if you go from a 12-game slate to a 2-game slate or a 3-game slate, it's going to have a pretty significant impact, at least relatively.
Yeah.
That being said, I think one of the changes is I do think compared to before, I think all of the slider defaults are not changing as much as they used to. I think like the range of sliders that you'll get based on both contest type and slate size, I think are like staying closer to like the average or whatever the starting point. Whereas before, I think they would change pretty drastically between the different for slate size or contest types. What we found is that like there's not as big of a jump, I would say, between like, you know, we're not getting up to like 10 sim precision. We're not going down to 0 correlation anywhere. Like its correlation is generally sticking between 2 and 5. Ownership is generally sticking between 1 and 4. Sim precision is generally sticking between like 5 and 8.
Yeah.
No matter what type of, you know, for all the defaults. So that would be the other like kind of pattern or trend that's different from before.
And regarding the relationship of the sliders to either contest and slate size, were you surprised by the findings there overall that those factors had less of an impact on what we feel like is the optimal sliders for both like differing contests and slate size?
a little bit surprised. Not it makes sense when you think about it, though. It's like I don't think it's unintuitive. I think it makes sense
Mhm.
that we I think the builder is like good at building good lineups
Mhm.
um, for within like a range of. I think if you get to the extremes where you're doing like 10, 10, 10 or whatever, like you are going to get some weird stuff. But I think
Yeah.
in general, in those middle ranges, like um, I think the lineups don't change that much. If you're just like if you're not changing anything with the projections or anything like that, like you're getting somewhat similar exposures. And because we're using the Sims and we were testing these using the Sims, like they're good lineups, I think, no matter what. And like if you play good lineups, it, they're gonna, be good kind of no matter what contest you enter.
Right.
There's a limit to that, but like 1,000 entries, 10,000 entries, 100,000, I think, um, like playing lineups that have well projected players that are correlated, that have upside are going to be good in many different types of contests. Um,
Uh,
and and yeah, so I think that's it. That makes sense to me. Um, that the sliders don't need to change that much to like sort of maximize um, the value. And I think what we found in this contest sim stuff is that like there is value to like to the SaberSim projections and the model outside of like I we talk a lot about like the value of the ranges of outcomes and correlations and the sims themselves, which are really valuable. But
yeah.
there's also value in just like our model and like our projections are good, and a lot of that was kind of you don't want to get rid of that value by like going too much on the like high sim precision kind of other than more extreme examples where it's really small slates or showdowns or whatever. You still want to take advantage of the value you're getting from our models.
Right. That makes sense. And I think I don't even know if relieved is the right word, but it definitely checked out with my intuition as well that contest size or entry limit has some effect on what is the optimal strategy, but it is not an enormous change in the optimal strategy between those contests. And I've talked about that a little bit on office hours before as well when we get questions from somebody that says, "Hey, how should I use SaberSim to build a single entry lineup?" And my answer to that has always really been, well, there are things you should do a little bit differently, but your overall sense of what the strategy is to play this game should not be completely changing purely because of the entry limit of the contest you're playing. And I think our findings here kind of checked out with some of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I did want to kind of go a little bit further into each individual slider and talk about what's changed here. So I think I want to start with correlation. It's been one that we've gotten a lot of questions about. I think it is also one where we are challenging conventional wisdom a little bit more. Before we jump into that, do you want to give a quick overview of actually what the correlation slider does, how it actually works when it comes time to build lineups?
Yeah.
If it would
So
if it would be easier, you could give just, I know they're all related. So if you want to give kind of an overview of just like what the sliders do, maybe that's a little bit easier.
sure. Yeah. I will try to not ramble on too much
Okay.
because yeah, but like correlation. So correlation is obviously like how the player performances relate to each other. When one player does well, another is more likely to do well, and vice versa. Um, we a few months ago switched to using an upside correlation metric rather than just like the Pearson coefficient. Basically, the upside correlation metric is like measuring the impact that a player's ceiling or upside performance has on the rest of the players in the game. And so we use that correlation metric, which is basically just there's a number for each combination of two players. So player A and player B will have some number that indicates their correlation. Um, and when we build lineups, we're essentially incorporating the combination of like those correlation numbers into how we are um, determining the best lineups. So rather than just determining the best lineups by projection or like the score and the bucket of sims that we're using, correlation is also saying, okay, both try to find the best score, and also include like some weight, and that's determined by like how high the correlation slider is. Incorporate like the total correlation between all the players in the lineup into that like equation that we're trying to solve. So the more total correlation you have between players in your lineups, the higher that lineup is going to be rated. But we are still incorporating the like sim scores, which is determined by sim precision, in that. And so the higher the correlation, the more correlation impacts the best lineup that it's chosen relative to those sim scores. So at like correlation weight of 1, it'll have a little bit of impact. So we'll be looking at correlation, but not it won't be as strong as the sim scores. At correlation 10, it's going to be a very strong factor in the in that equation.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's how that works. I mentioned sim precision. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. Finish your thought. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I mentioned sim precision, so I just want to go over that as well.
Yeah.
So sim precision it's like kind of a key slider here, and it's a little bit different than the other two because it's essentially so we simulate each game thousands of times. The sim precision slider is determining how many of those thousands of sims we use for each lineup. So essentially, for each lineup that we build, we will like randomly select some number of sims and use the average fantasy points of the players in those sims as their projection. So at sim precision of 10, it'll be 1 sim per lineup. And so each player's like projection when we build that lineup is the fantasy points that they scored in that simulation of the game. At sim precision of 0, we're just using the mean projection, the projection that you see in the app. And everything in between is somewhere in between the 0 or the 1 and all thousands of sims, depending on the sport. And so a different way of explaining that is basically the higher the sim precision, the more like randomness you get, but that randomness is like smart in that it's like randomness that comes from the sims, and it's correlated randomness. And so in like a set of 3 sims, if like a pitcher in a game does really, really well, the opposing batters are going to have much lower projections. So you're kind of incorporating some correlation just naturally through that sim precision slider. The other thing to mention here is that the sim precision slider and the correlation slider and ownership, really, they are like related, so they're not independent.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, like a really high sim precision slider, especially for MLB, is going to lead to like a wider range of projections for each lineup, and the like top lineup will have basically the projections of all the players will be higher with a higher sim precision, and that means that correlation has like less relative impact.
Yeah.
And so what we saw in some of the testing is that like there were some builds that were highly rated that had like very low sim precision and low correlation. And I think the reason is that like when you have a 0 sim precision, correlation actually like you only need a 2 or a 3 to get pretty strong stacks, because like those projections are pretty tight, and so you only need a little bump in order to like really value correlation highly. Whereas if you have really high sim precision, it's like this one player might get 3 home runs in a game, and that is just going to like overweight any amount of correlation that you put into that equation, because they just like had this super outlier game. And so like that'll prevent you from getting as strong with stacks even with high correlation. So yeah, that's that. I just want to explain that part of that interaction very quickly. ownership fade is a bit simpler. It's essentially just adjusting all of the players for their ownership projection, and that's relative to like the average ownership projection of the field. And so in smaller slates, like they're not going to be a 70% owned player is not going to be punished as much as a 70% owned player in a big slate. And it's also relative to the variant, their standard deviation. So high owned pitchers will be punished less than high owned batters because they have a lower standard deviation, and vice versa. Low owned batters will get boosted more than low owned pitchers, because basically it's like if higher variance means like it's just more important to fade a high owned player or get more of a low owned player, because like you want to take advantage of those like outlier performances that kind of contradict what their ownership would indicate their expected performances. Maybe that was a confusing way of explaining it, but yeah.
No, I that makes sense. I think the pitcher and the hitter example is I think the clearest way to think about that, and I think a lot of people also know that intuitively, that like pitching chalk is a little bit safer than hitting chalk, right? And that's kind of what the calculation there is intended to pull out. How does variance relate to ownership there? I think one point that I just really want to stress, because it's key here, and I think it's something that we really did pull out from this project, is that the sliders are really truly a set. And I guess in particular, ownership fade and correlation both relate very highly to sim precision. In other words, saying my correlation is at 5 doesn't actually really tell you much about what you're going to get in that build without the context of where sim precision is as well, because it's changing. The way I kind of think about it, that helps for me, is sim precision almost happens first, that the sim buckets are selected for in a given lineup, and then correlation and ownership fade are factors that change the projections that players scored in sim buckets. Is that a good way of looking at it, do you think, there, or am I off base?
Yeah, no, you're definitely right.
Okay.
And like we saw that in the results of this, is that like if you hold like precision, like say precision 0 through 2 constant, the top the best, like highest ROI builds are going to have like a small amount of correlation, 2 correlation. But if say you hold 5 to 7 precision constant, the top ROI builds are going to have like 5 correlation. And so, even in these settings, like they relate to each other in terms of, using 10 correlation and 0 precision is a very bad idea, because you're just like way overweighting correlation, and you're not really getting any extra value beyond like a certain point.
Would you say there too, and that if somebody were to make changes to a slider, that maybe they should make changes to the other as well? Like if somebody looked at this and did want to increase correlation or did want to increase imprecision, that it makes sense to also, if I want a more diversified portfolio, just as an example, and I come up to 9, that potentially turning up the other sliders as well makes some sense, because it's
I think so. Yeah.
I think that's a good takeaway here as well. So I do want to talk a little bit here about like what's actually implied by what we found here, particularly, starting with correlation. When we pull this build up, right, this is the default settings for a 20 max, 10 to 50K. For tonight's, it's a 9-game baseball slate. We are seeing a lot of the commonly liked stacks featured at the top here: 5-3, 5-2, 4-3, 4-2-2. But both within our top 20 here and within the pool overall, there are stacks that I would say are not somewhat conventional, or not generally what you hear. 3-2s, 3-2-2s. Particularly these stacks that are a 3 stack as the largest, stack in the lineup, I've noticed in my lineups are coming up a lot more. What are your thoughts overall with these stack types, and just the idea that, we found that optimal correlation was lower than we expected, and that maybe that there are more stack types that are viable than the field thinks or expects?
Yeah, I think, I've been doing SaberSim and playing DFS for many years, and I think over the years I've gone back and forth on this question quite a lot of like, sometimes some years I'll like just want to play smaller stacks and like a wide diversity, and other ones I'm like, oh no, like you got to just force stacks. Like that's what all the pros are doing, or most pros are just like forcing these stacks. And it feels like if we're recommending something that's like not used by most like professional players, that feels weird. But I think the main reason is that it's just like no one else but us can like incorporate this type of like natural diversity of stack types. And so like if you can't do that, then heuristics are really good in terms of you just create higher, bigger stacks, and you'll get like, that's good. You're not hurting yourself in general by forcing stacks, because like tons of people do it. Like clearly there are many like very profitable players that do that. You can be a profitable player by just playing 4 and 5 stacks. So we're definitely not saying like, oh, you have to do this, but I think it's just like any sort of exposure management in, with players, with teams, is that there's like different paths to winning GPPs. Sometimes it's like with big stacks, and sometimes it's not. And I think like the idea that there's always like the best lineup or the best build is always going to be these super strong stacks, and like that's going to be the winning lineup, is just too like binary way of thinking about it. And I think in the contest sims, when we were measuring like how good are these pools of lineups, especially using omega ratio, it's like sometimes there's going to be a slate where the top scoring team only scores 6 runs, and sometimes the top scoring team is going to score 15 runs or whatever. And like there's just different ways that slates can play out. And the other thing is like the field is stacking pretty strongly. Not like there are a lot of people that still don't stack, but like, and especially depending on the contests, in some contests that are sharper, like a vast majority of the lineups, especially the lineups that are like good, are going to be stacking strongly. And I think you can get some leverage by like having a similar set of exposures to like the top players, but having a more diverse set of stack types, where it's like maybe like the chalkiest team on the slate is, just like tons of people play 5 stacks of the chalkiest team on the slate, and you have a bunch of like 3 stacks with them, and like turns out only 3 of the players on the team scored really well. You end up getting like some good one-offs. I mean, there's like ways that I can explain like the paths to winning, but it's essentially like we looked at all the sims, all the different ways that the slates can play out, and like just forcing a 5 or 4 stack isn't necessarily like the optimal way of playing. Getting some like one-offs where like you're just getting more diverse. You're like leaning into the projections more and the sims more, rather than just like forcing correlation for correlation's sake. And so I mean, it's kind of it's a little bit hard to like explain why it's so good. I think a lot of the analysis that has been done on MLB stacks has a lot of like logical fallacies. And I mean, I think one of the big ones that I've seen is just like people, I mean, if it's a really bad analysis, it's just going to say like, hey, look at like the stack types that win. It's generally these types of stacks. And obviously like you have to compare like, okay, top 1% of the contest to like the entire contest. So say 10% of the contest plays 5 threes, but it's 5 threes end up in the top 1% or in the top 10 20% of the time. You might say, oh, well, 5 threes must be like a good stack because they're winning, they're getting to the top 1% more than you would expect based on their like total exposure. But like part of the reason for that could just be like really good players. Maybe there's like, Osimo or like Nerdy Tenor or whatever, like some of the top players. I probably should mention like Giant Squid. He's better than everyone else. But no, like maybe like they're essentially forcing stacks. but they're also like playing good plays, and so like
Right.
they're winning for reasons that are unrelated to the type of stack that they're playing. And so when you do this analysis of like, oh, 5-3s are winning more often, maybe it's not actually because of the 5-3s. It's just because like people playing 5-3s are winning for other reasons, because they have good projections, because they have a good process, good game theory approach, whatever. So, I think a lot of people that have these heuristics in mind have seen that type of analysis or done that type of analysis, but like it's really hard to analyze, to like separate out the impact of the size of the stack from all the other variables that go into like probability of winning.
Yeah. I agree. And I think one of the things that you mentioned there is, a lot of times you get these heuristics that a certain stack size is good is because that is what you have to do with the traditional optimizer or when you're hand building to think about correlation at all. That these other tools don't understand individual player to player correlations. So you can't trust that a 3-2 lineup built with some other optimizer that doesn't get correlation is going to be good, because it's just an arbitrary rule that you put in. So you end up with the heuristics say maximize that correlative effect, because then at least you're like directionally correct, but you're not being precise there. And that's the difference here, is that we can say, no, these 3-3s or this 3-2 lineup actually probably is good because it values correlation precisely for what is appropriate to that sim. And I think a great idea, I've gotten a lot of questions here over the past week from people that are like, hey, can you really play a 3-2 or can you really play a 3-3-2? Because it's not maybe what checks out conventionally. I really recommend going and building your lineups and pulling some of those lineups up and just looking at them. And I think you can kind of see at least the thesis of the lineup. For those listening to the audio version of this, maybe the podcast version, I have something up on my screen here. I have a lineup. It's a 3 Seattle stack with 2 twins and then 1-offs elsewhere. This lineup, to turn this into a 5 stack, would sacrifice leadoff Carson Kelly, Vlad Guerrero Jr., or Nelson Cruz, who has obvious upside, to play more Mariners, which, sometimes might make sense, but it's, it's kind of clear that maybe in this particular lineup, you don't need to sacrifice the additional projection basically to play more Mariners when you can instead play these high upside and also low owned hitters elsewhere in the lineup. So I think, at the end of the day, one thing I always talk about in office hours is that stacks and constructions, like saying this is a 5-3, is something that is descriptive about a lineup. But you should be able to strip away that description and look at that lineup just for the individual players it has in it and still think that's good. And if you can't do that, then maybe it should be a 3-3-2 or a 3-2 lineup and not necessarily be that 5-3 that only exists because of the arbitrary rule that was put in to put it in there.
Go ahead. Sorry. Yeah, I was just gonna say, Eric from our team actually just like messaged me, and because I had mentioned Nerdy Tenor, and he's like, well, actually, like that's apparently not a great example. I haven't like looked at his stuff, but I think he's like one of the famously simulation based pros, and apparently like his exposures are pretty similar to like what SaberSim is spitting out here, where he has like a very wide range of stack types, and he is like a simulation based builder, unlike probably a lot of other pros if they're using kind of traditional optimizers. And I'm not trying to like shit talk other pros that do that, because obviously like people like Osmo or whoever that are like using traditional optimizers, they're good players, and obviously there are many paths to being a winning DFS player, but I think you can see the difference in stack types of people that like use those traditional optimizers and kind of just have to use those heuristics versus someone that's using a more simulation-based approach.
The last note I'll add on to the correlation, and then I want to move on to some of these other things here, is I think even if you are opinionated about what stack types you want to play, which is perfectly fine. I think that makes sense. If you say, I get it, I hear what you're saying, I still want at least a minimum of a 4 stack. Whether you're getting there by adjusting your exposures in the post-build process or by setting a stacking rule pre-build, I think the lower correlation that we've arrived at here for the new defaults should bring you to better overall lineups anyway. you should get better versions of those 5 stacks and better versions of those 4 stacks now, because we're not
Yep.
overvaluating the correlation component of that equation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so
So
like bad, yeah, exactly. It's, the higher you have correlation, the more, like, the less we care about just like the projection itself. Players that are really bad, and this isn't to say that you shouldn't ever play bad players in your stacks, because that's the point of stacking, is that like, or the point of this of correlation is that it can like kind of make a bad player good, or like give a bad player more opportunities to get points, even if
mhm.
they don't usually. But there's like, a limit to that. And yeah, the higher you have correlation, it's like someone that's just like, they're never gonna hit a home run. They're batting ninth. They're like, maybe they have a pinch hit risk, and like they're not even expected to bat more than 3 plate appearances. Like, if you jack up the correlation enough, you might get too much of that player just in order to like force them in with like the top players on the team. Um, and yeah, it just doesn't make sense. I think like a good example is also like the Angels, where you know they're obviously an extreme example of a team that has like Trout and Otani
Mhm.
as some of the best players alive, and then like a lot of players that aren't that good. And if you're just forcing 5 stacks, like if the Angels are say a high team total, they're facing a bad pitcher, like you're just gonna like force in all of these kind of bad players. Yeah, tonight might not be a good example, but like, you would be forcing in all these bad players with your Angel stacks, where like maybe you want more of the just like Trout Otani um, combinations. So
Yeah, no, that makes
um,
and that's
yeah,
another good example of like where, saying, "Oh, I have 5 threes in all my lineups," doesn't really necessarily tell the whole story about the lineup quality there. And I think
yeah,
sometimes, especially for baseball, this is something that I think people have, especially over the past couple of years, embraced a little bit more for football. Like that correlation can be applied to a good football lineup in kind of a diverse way, and that what you need to do to make a Lamar Jackson lineup successful is different than what you need to do to make a Derek
hmm,
Carr lineup successful or something like that. But we haven't really gotten there with baseball yet, just in the DFS industry, that the conventional wisdom is still like a very clear law. You must 5 stack on DK. And
hmm,
I think it's kind of exciting that we are challenging that a little bit, because I think there's an
yeah,
opportunity. Even, I was thinking back at the very start of baseball season, I had you on here as well. And I asked you a question about what do you think might be a very 2022 edge in baseball DFS. And you said unconventional stack types, that stack types that are still value correlation appropriately, but don't fit into the clean cut little boxes that everybody has kind of created for what is
hmm,
okay in baseball DFS. And I found that interesting, coming full circle here now. We're at the end of August, having done this project, that's like one of I think the big takeaways here.
yep, yep, definitely.
I know correlation to me, I think, was maybe one of the bigger surprises here, one of the bigger changes to the default sliders overall. Are there any takeaways that you have with the way that ownership fade or sim precision changed here as a result of this that you want to kind of touch on or talk about a little bit?
I mean, I think ownership fade went down a bit for I think especially for like really big. I mean, it's at 4 right now, which is honestly, I thought it was lower, but yeah, like 4 for like a really big contest. I think maybe it would have been a little bit higher before, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe it just sort of depends on the slate. But I think like for really big slates, and this is intuitive, like you don't need crazy ownership, even if it's like a really big contest. And ownership fade also, like the builder is uh, kind of already incorporating the slate size a little bit with ownership fade. We still vary it based on the size of the slate, but yeah, I mean, overall, it kind of just had a lower impact than correlation and variance on like the omega ratio
Mm-hmm.
metric that we were looking at, which is, I think, kind of interesting. It just like seemed to have uh, the correlation sliders seem to like matter more. Um, but I think it's because we're like, yeah, I guess I'm not really, I don't have a lot of like really smart insight into ownership fade. I think that's probably an area. To be honest, I think ownership fade is an area that I would like to look at more on the builder end in the future, in terms of like incorporating it in a maybe a smarter way. Not to say that we do it badly now. I think we do it really, especially with like incorporating the variance and like the standard deviation of the player into how important it is. But I think that there's like more that we can do there. But I also think that ownership for me is more of a like after the build completes type of like you can maybe get some more like game theory ownership edge
Yeah.
in determining how to select from your pool. And so I think because omega ratio is maximizing like upside but minimizing risk, like it's not going to give you like super contrarian lineups
Hmm.
because like we're trying to create a diversified lower risk pool. But like this is creating this diversified pool, but you can like have zero ownership fade and then still have really like contrarian lineups in selecting from the pool.
Yeah.
And I think that is an area where there can be some like um, user value or just like your depending on your play style and how much risk you want to have, how much you enjoy playing a style of like a more what they call exploitative nowadays, exploitative style where it's like you're really taking advantage of like fading kind of the chalky plays and leaning into the plays that we like more than the field or you like more than the field. Um, I don't know, this is getting a little bit off the topic of the defaults, but like for me, I think uh, my style of play is generally to um, not differentiate too much or not get too um, have too high ownership fade in like the build itself. And if I'm going to like make those game theory decisions, it would be more like in my exposure management on step 3. But I think a lot of what this contest sim analysis showed is that you don't necessarily need to like fade. You can get different and have like edge without necessarily making really uh, risky or um, like extreme kind of decisions about being different than the field.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, part of the takeaway for me, ownership coming down a little bit and seeing that the lineups that you get out of that still having plenty of low owned plays. I think sometimes the like fading the chalk, like some people talking about ownership and talking about where to fade ownership are probably almost already overdoing it a little bit. That you don't need as much fade as you might think to get a lineup that is well leveraged against the field, even for some of these larger field GPPs, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, 2 of the chalky, like on tonight's slate, Cole, DeGrom, Lynn kind of seems like a 3-horse race. There are a ton of lineup constructions featured in here that have 2 of those 3 guys and manage to get a
Mm-hmm.
ton of lower owned bats alongside of it
Right.
with not.
Especially with the correlation, like if you're doing unconventional stack types, then like you're kind of already getting a like a differentiation and some like leverage just in like that type of lineup that you're playing where like if you're playing a 3-2 or a 4-2 or whatever,
Right.
like you can play the 4 chalkiest batters or the 3 chalkiest batters in your stack and then still just be like very different from the field by having that unconventional stack type. um and the other thing I think is that remember that these defaults and this analysis that we did was based on using only SaberSim projections and like using all of the other defaults the same.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not saying like no matter what you input into the builder, these are the best defaults. We're saying like
Yeah.
given everything else is the same. If you are like making, say you're doing aggregate projections, you're taking like downloading from a bunch of other sources, aggregating them, uploading to SaberSim, and then building, you probably want higher ownership fade because you're going to match the field in your projections a lot closer.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you're using default SaberSim, like there are going to be players that we like a lot more than the field or a lot less than the field, and so you don't need ownership fade to just like get leverage from those players because they'll naturally show up a lot in your lineups. But if you're like really matching the field on projection or matching the field on stack type. Like the more that you're trying to like, the more similar you are to the other players in the contest that you're entering, like the more you have to differentiate somewhere else. So if you're really similar in projection and stack type that you're inputting, then you probably have to do more ownership fade to like give yourself that differentiation. Or if you're really similar, like if you're forcing, it's just kind of like you have to have a little bit of differentiation, but like naturally with SaberSim, you'll probably get a little bit of that anyway. But again, there might be slates where like we're really similar to the field, and so you might just want higher ownership fade even using our projections. And so that kind of leads me to something that I thought of earlier I didn't say, is that like these are the slider defaults in our testing across like all the slates we looked at, but like each slate is different, and we're not saying like these are guaranteed to be the top sliders for each particular slate. And I'm hoping from this call and just from office hours and from our education to people and talking about this more, we can kind of all learn together like what is the reason for these sliders, and like when is it a smart idea to change them based on like either the characteristics of that slate itself, or your play style, or the characteristics of the contest that you're entering. There's all these different factors, and like we're kind of aggregating a lot of those factors together and like taking the average and saying, okay, across all contests that fit within this bucket, across all these different types of slates, I mean, for the slate size, it's like these are the best sliders. But again, sorry, I'm rambling on, but I think there's just like you can find reasons to adjust these sliders based on each individual slate if you kind of know what you're doing. But that's why we want to explain like why these settings are the way that they are.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well said. And I do like the idea too of thinking about, where am I doing things that is or are similar to what the field is going to do, and where am I getting a little bit different, and kind of changing those levers, or at least thinking about those things all together on a per slate level. I could go on here talking about this back and forth for hours. I do want to make sure that we get to the questions that people have asked here. So let's go ahead. Let's rip through some questions real quickly here. One that Rogue had mentioned here, this is in YouTube chat, and he said, is there any type of active machine learning or monitoring for confirmed outcomes over the next couple months to see if we need to make changes to these sliders? Or is this just something that we're planning on kind of revisiting every few months and seeing where we're at? What are your thoughts there? I think that's a good question about like where we're going in the future here.
Yeah. So it's not, I wouldn't say we have like active where we're just like automatically like running these sims every day or every week. But we absolutely are going to revisit it. I mean, baseball season has a month left, so I think we probably aren't going to revisit the MLB slider defaults until next season. But I expect that we will like rerun this analysis, maybe more in depth, and like I'm sure that there will be some changes to the builder or to our models or whatever that we'll want to retest and really dial in these sliders. So certainly MLB, like before next season, we will like revisit and probably adjust. NFL, I think I saw someone else asked about that. Like we haven't run the analysis for NFL yet, but we plan to. And I think for all sports, it's something that we're going to be visiting, but it is a bit, if you listen to Behind the Sims, it was quite a process. I think a lot of the hurdles that we came across we fixed, so it shouldn't be quite as long of a process as with MLB. But we'll be running this stuff as much as we can, but there's a lot of things that we want to test beyond just the slider defaults. We're going to be testing, or we hope to be testing SaberScore and some new features that we're going to be releasing in the future with this kind of contest sim analysis. So I mean, not automated, but active is kind of the quick answer.
Cool. Yeah. On the NFL note, I know. So we took what we learned basically from this project and applied it to other sports, including NFL, which is, I think everybody's very excited for this coming up next week. What are your thoughts about the way that the strength of that assumption, I guess, that the takeaways here apply to NFL as well. And any thoughts on, for somebody, building their week 1 lineups next Sunday, thoughts on and maybe any changes that you might want people to make or things to think about as they're using the new sliders there.
Yeah. So we did lower correlation a bit in NFL, similar to MLB. Some of it was just based on this. And now I think some of the analysis that we did was a bit independent of the sport, of just like, hey, this is what kind of makes sense. It's like the relationship between these different contest types. Some of the changes we made were just a bit intuitive. If you run builds with higher correlation, you just get some stack types that don't make a lot of intuitive sense. But I mean, I'm not like with MLB. I'm not going to rule out those types of like. I think with higher correlation in NFL, it was kind of the opposite problem. We were ending up with like a lot of like QB plus 3 and 1 run back or 2 run backs like over the majority of your lineups. And I think that is sometimes an optimal build, but I wouldn't say that you should like force in, essentially like 5-man game stack into every lineup.
Right.
And so I think these new defaults will lead to a bit more of intuitive stack types. But again, you're going to get a wide variety. It's not forcing in, 2 pass catchers and 1 run back in every lineup like some people like to do. It's going to be some mix of QB plus 1, QB plus 2, some run backs, some not, some really big game stacks, and some not. And then, the other thing is, we are in previous years we used like the traditional correlation metric, and we are using like the upside correlation that we've talked about in the past, that I talked about earlier in this stream. So that is new with NFL, and I think that's going to lead to some higher quality lineups overall, because basically it's saying like in the top, say 90th percentile of this player's performances, how does that affect everyone else? And so obviously for QBs, like that's going to really boost their wide receivers, but for like each individual pass catcher, they're going to see, I think, a stronger negative correlation with other pass catchers on the same team at that higher upside correlation, whereas maybe their mean correlation would be like 0 or slightly negative. It's now going to be much more strongly negative between. I'm not good with NFL, but two wide receivers on the same team that might compete for touchdown share. They could both maybe get 1 or 2 touchdowns, but they're not going to both get 3 touchdowns or whatever. Or they're not both going to get 150 receiving yards. So that's I think going to be a big improvement with the types of lineups that you get.
Yeah, I would again say too that for NFL, I think people are very opinionated sometimes about the constructions they want to see in their lineups. Even if that's you and you're setting stacking rules, the changes here, the slightly lower correlation value should, I think, lead to a better construction within those parameters across the board. So we'll go ahead. We'll keep it rolling here. I'm going to hit a few more questions. I do want to just quickly note that I'm going to focus on questions here today that are focused around the sliders and the new slider defaults. I see some other questions coming in about some other things. I'll try to get to those here before the end of the show. But first, I want to just focus on all the questions about the new sliders. There was a good one from Mark here that I wanted to touch on. I think we kind of hit on this earlier today or earlier in the stream, but he said, one question I have: when using the profit plan, should I set the sliders to an average or a weighted average of my contests, or should I use the sliders set at the largest numbers, for example, matching the largest contests? What are your thoughts on this, especially with the new defaults? I know a ton of people, myself included, are basically building their lineups this way, where you're grouping all of your your DFS profit plan portfolio into one build, and you have to set one set of sliders there to build that. What do you think?
That's a good question. I would probably just kind of try to find, I would either choose one. like I said at the beginning, they're all pretty similar. So I don't think you're going to get a huge difference between the sliders. If you're doing like some bunch of single entries, 20 max, 150 max, you could choose just like the 20 max one. In general, like what I would say is first of all, I would probably increase the pool size if you're like doing a ton of contests together.
I definitely agree there.
I'm thinking about that just this on the fly, but I think I would increase the pool size so you're just going to get more to work with. Like if you're planning on playing 500 unique lineups, then obviously like we've optimized these sliders to give you the best set of 500 lineups, but like you're still just going to have more to work with the 1500. And I might like lower sim precision. Let me know if this doesn't make sense to you, Jordan, because I'm just thinking about this on the fly. But like, if you have really high sim precision, I think you end up with like a higher chance that you'll get some like weird lineups or like not the best lineups in. Like, obviously, we try to build you a pool where all of the lineups are viable, but like you might get some weird lineups that are just like, oh, these are some outlier performances by some players. And if you're playing like a very high percentage of your pool across all your lineups, then you want to make sure that like they're all high quality. So like you could lean towards the defaults that are like lower sim precision. Overall, I think it doesn't matter much. Is the long story short. I think you can just choose one of them and you'll be fine. We did choose like I thought about. For the single entry, we kind of discussed like, well, should we not use omega ratio? Should we just use the mean RY because we don't care about diversification? And even for the single entry defaults, we decided on still optimizing for like a diversified lineup pool because you might play 20 different single entry contests and like play 20 unique lineups from this pool in those contests. And so we still set them to be like optimized for a diversified pool.
Yeah. For me, I think on the very practical level, I don't think for market really makes much of a difference here. I think like whether you do a kind of weighted average approach or just pick eyeball kind of a midpoint set of sliders, which often for me ends up being 20 max, 10 to 50K. I think the impact of that on your lineups is going to be pretty small. I think on more of the theoretical level, I actually tend to almost want okay, this is like very, very theoretical. I almost actually tend to prefer to have a higher sim precision the higher my pool size gets.
Because yes, I agree with that. Yeah. So what I would say is like the higher percentage of your pool, like you take the ratio between number of lineups and pool size, the higher that ratio is, the lower your sim precision should be. So like, right, because basically it's like you're sorting through the top X, like you're pulling out the top X% of your pool for your final lineups. And so like, you're essentially like dropping out some percentage of your pool and you're not playing those lineups, depending on how much you're like messing with exposures and stuff. But like, yeah, I agree that if you're increasing the pool size to 1500, you can do higher sim precision because you're kind of like filtering down to like the best lineups. But then if you're going to play 500 unique lineups from the 1500 or whatever, then like you might want to lower sim precision a bit because you're playing like a higher percentage. You want to make sure that they're all high quality. I don't know. That's just what I'm thinking, but
yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think, another question here. I'm gonna move us along here. And this is a good one as well. So Pippin had asked, I'm not sure if this has been discussed, but I'm assuming that these sliders were back tested on DraftKings only. So any tips or tricks of incorporating those into FanDuel, given the difference in lineup constraints? I also think scoring differences is worth noting. For example, moving correlation or precision up or down a tick or two. Any thoughts? I know we definitely did just do our analysis on
Yep.
DraftKings here. Any thoughts on how it changes to FanDuel there?
Yeah, I've thought about this yesterday. So I only play on FanDuel because I'm in Oregon and we can't play on DraftKings. So it's definitely relevant for me. Um, in general, because of FanDuel scoring, like you mentioned, I think runs and RBIs are a higher percentage of fantasy points on FanDuel than on DraftKings. And so in like correlation matters more, but like the correlation values themselves are higher, like in the Sims, right? So the same correlation weight on FanDuel should give you bigger stacks than on DraftKings. So I am not sure. I don't think the scoring necessarily means you have to do higher correlation because I think like that'll just be incorporated with the values themselves. I'm not sure if like the field is like if the field is weaker on FanDuel, then you might want like lower ownership fade, but I don't know if that's really the case or not. I think maybe it is that it's a little bit softer on FanDuel. And like generally the softer the field, the more like the less ownership fade you want to do because like you don't need that.
I think that's a
Yeah,
really
I don't
good
know.
point. I do think there's something worth pulling out there of, if for one reason or another, whether it's because of a difference in a site or contest, if you believe that you're playing against a sharper field, I actually think there's an argument to increase your ownership fade a bit because that sharper field is going to be more predictable in getting close to what you expect them to do. Like one thing that's I think this is, don't even necessarily talk about this enough. Like, when you are turning up the ownership fade, you're not only saying I want to value ownership more, but you're also expressing increased confidence in the ownership projections themselves because you're making that value higher. So, like it just popped into my head because Eric here just asked a question about like FanDuel Live finals. I actually think in like probably what is a very sharp field for the FanDuel Live final, there would be somewhat of an argument to turn up that ownership fade a bit more from what the default would be for that contest, because more likely than just a totally random field that people are going to play a little bit more optimally there. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I agree. I also think, I mean, for something like the live final, I mean, so I have 2 tickets to the live final like in 2 weeks. I will be adjusting ownership projections manually, probably.
Yeah.
Because I think they're just going to be different than like a normal contest.
Yes, for sure.
And so I think with that, I probably will increase ownership fade. Because like you said, I'm going to feel more confident in the ownership projections. Like if you feel more confident in them, and like I think they're just going to be. I mean, I guess ownership fade is kind of relative to the ownership projections, but like I think I want to be different because it's. I think there'll be like very high owned players. There's going to be some really chalky players, and I think it'll help to have some game theory. Yeah, sorry, I don't have super coherent thoughts here, but I think you're right that like the more confident you are in your ownership projections, the higher you should increase that slider. So,
Yeah.
but in general for FanDuel, I don't think that there's like changes that I would make to the defaults.
Cool. Yeah, and I think the big point there is that a lot of the differences between the sites are, I think, expressed in the scoring structures, and that's already accounted for in the way that sim precision works. That like the output of what happens in a sim is converted to FanDuel points or converted to DraftKings points before lineups start getting made. So you kind of get to take into account the fact that like RBIs and runs or whatever are worth more there.
Yeah.
Let's see. There was a question. This came in via email here from Jody right before we actually started the stream. And I think this is an interesting question. But the question says, thoughts on correlation changing throughout the year based on things like weather differences from spring baseball to summer baseball, trades, teams not even caring about winning anymore, pitchers just getting tired and like arms wearing out. I think this is kind of a creative question and one that I haven't really thought about before, but do you have any thoughts on the way that like your desire to stack up teams or value correlation more or less might change throughout a baseball season?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is similar to the FD, the FanDuel scoring thing, where like the correlation values themselves will change depending on like how much we're expecting teams to score and stuff like that. And so like I wouldn't necessarily say that the correlation weight slider should change based on those things, but like those are important factors to correlation. So like for MLB, obviously, like the point of doing correlation is like to get those upside games where the team is scoring a bunch of runs. But things like, yeah, I mean, weather is one of those ones that obviously we don't incorporate like rain delays or postponements into the sim. We incorporate temperature. I guess that's probably what that was referring to, is temperature, which does increase scoring. But it made me think of like, if there's a chance that the game gets called after 7 innings, like if there's going to be a storm that rolls in 2 hours after start time, so like that's going to limit the upside of the game, and so like maybe you don't want as strong of stacks for that game. I mean, this is getting like I wouldn't necessarily change sliders. I might change exposures here, but I do think it's an interesting question with like the rain delay risk. Teams not caring about winning anymore. Like pinch hit risk is a big thing for sure in terms of correlation. So like for the Giants, they're like notorious for doing a ton of pinch hitting. And so like they're just a worse team to stack in general. Again, this is not necessarily changing how I would do the correlation weight, and it should be, we do incorporate pinch hit risk in the sim, but that's more of like a risk management exposure limiting type thing, where you might want to limit like giant stacks, especially when they're really chalky and coolers. Like they just have a high pinch hit risk, which really lowers like the upside of the lineup. So that's definitely a big thing. I think all of these factors do impact correlation. I think a lot of them we incorporate into the sim, and so they'll be naturally in the correlation numbers. Some of them we don't incorporate into the sim, like a pitcher getting tired at the end of the year, like where they've like thrown 200 innings, like that's not part of the sim. And if you think that there's like value there, that's like something where you'll probably get more value out of just changing their projection rather than,
I agree.
like, the impact on correlation. If you think that a player like, I don't know, Kyle Wright, who's like a younger player, just looking at this list, like he's a younger player, maybe he's like not as stretched out and he's like gonna get tired at this, I don't know, or like he's not gonna have as long of a leash, and the manager is gonna like not let him go past 5 or 6 innings. Not saying that's the case, but those are the kind of value adds in step 1 here, and like changing the projections based on that kind of information that's not in the sim.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's some sharp ideas here. I think sometimes what's difficult about things like, a team that's well out of the playoffs, not really caring about winning anymore, it's hard to quantify. But I think if you can kind of make an attempt to quantify some of that stuff, I think adjusting team totals or potentially player projections is probably the better place to apply that than tweaking the correlation slider or something like that. That's my take there. Let me go ahead and see. This is a good question here, and I think we've kind of touched on this quite a bit, but I do just want to address this question directly. From Phantom, he said, in the research, how often did stacks go against the grain? Again, traditional optimizers lean towards FanDuel being 4, DK being 5. How often did mini stack show up as well? Just curious, a 2-stack took down the FanDuel nickel last night, so not sure if we want to leave stack exposures alone or focus more on a player team exposure. In a case that handful of 2-stacks might be viable. I think part of what's really interesting about this question, did we look at the actual like lineups or like lineup constructions at all to see like any kind of, rather than just seeing like what's optimal correlation slider, did we look at any like what stack type constructions have like the best omega ratio or anything like that?
No, we didn't.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think that would be interesting to look at, but again, I think there's a danger there of like looking at that and coming to these conclusions of like, oh, well, these stack instructions showed up more in the winning lineups, so these are the best stack instructions, when it's really dependent on the slate, and like that's the whole point of this, of like not using heuristics, is like we can just use the sims and kind of use what it gives us, rather than like we see these constructions winning and then therefore they're like, we conclude that they're the best constructions. But like you can do builds that match these sliders that we tested and see the types of constructions that are output, because like you already did previously on the call, we like ran a build, we saw all these different stack types in the exposures, and like that's what we analyzed. So clearly, I mean, it's clear to me that like, yes, in this analysis, a lot of mini stacks were viable, because if only 5-3 and 4-4 stacks were viable, then we would have seen higher correlation weight as like the best sliders. That said, I think it's very dangerous to like look at what wins on a specific slate. Like last night, FanDuel, the winner being a 2 stack, does not mean that you should include 2 stacks in your lineups, because there's just so much variance in baseball. Really any lineup, or like many different lineups can win, but that doesn't mean that the vast majority of those lineups that can win are going to be like not profitable most of the time, or like over the long run. So that 2 stack lineup that won, I mean, maybe it was the kind of thing that's like going to show up once in the 500 pool and it's actually viable, but more likely that is a lineup that is minus AV and you should not play it. But again, and I think, like I said at the beginning of the call, I think I know you've mentioned this too, Jordan, like there's nothing wrong with still kind of taking the scalpel at the end and like removing those stack types that just are like too small. Even though the builder like came up with them, we're not saying that like if you use these sliders, every single lineup in your pool will be perfect and like and it can't be improved. We're just trying to like give you the best set of lineups that we can, given like the constraints of the builder and whatever. But like I would personally remove any 2 stack, anything that's like less than a 3 stack from my lineups. I'm sure that you can get viable lineups that way, but it's just like you're not really losing anything by removing stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think even if you just like look at a build and look at like the stack pool exposure, you'll kind of see that those constructions aren't even like very heavily featured. Like a 0.4% exposure to a 2-2-2 stack. There's still a little bit of noise of like what kind of lineup can just sneak into a pool of 500. I think, using this as kind of I've actually, and this is kind of a side point here, but I've really been using this pool exposure a lot recently since we added the column and since we did this research as a measure of how viable that thing is for that contest, because we are thinking about the pool. We backtested the sliders to optimize for the pool. So I think that's actually pretty valid there. If you can see that there's a big difference in the viability of a 3-2 or a 3-2-2 than a 2-2-2 or a 2-2-2-2. And I think you can extend this to, players, teams, games, whatever you want as well. But that's something I've been looking at here. So there are still a ton of questions in the queue. I do think we are all caught up on questions that I would say are like directly related to this project here. So Matt, I would say, are there any other kind of final thoughts that you want to add on here regarding the new sliders, regarding this project as a whole, before I let you get out of here? And then I will stick around for everybody else that's been asking other questions about other parts of the SaberSim process. I'll stick around here and we'll do kind of an informal quick office hours here towards the end. But Matt, any other thoughts or anything that you want to talk about regarding the new sliders?
I feel like we went over so much. I want to reiterate that like I think one thing we haven't talked about is I've seen on Slack, like a lot of people I think have done well over the past few days since we implemented the new sliders, and a lot of people have been like, new sliders are great. I'm really glad, and maybe some of it is the new sliders. I think be careful about just like reacting to like the small sample size. It could have just been like luck. And the main reason I want to bring that up is just like, this isn't like the holy grail of like how to make perfect DFS lineups. I think this is, we are improving on like the defaults that we were giving anybody that's using SaberSim's. And now when you use the default sliders, you're going to get better lineups that are more likely to win than previously. But we're not saying like you cannot improve upon these lineups at all. We're not saying like every lineup in the pool is perfect or like should be used. I think that there's still like value that you can add. And I think just being knowledgeable about like what the sliders are doing, like listen to the Behind the Sims series and kind of learn about like what went into this. And I think that'll help you understand a bit more how the lineups are being built and like how you can make adjustments based on your play style or whatever. I mean, we talked a little bit on like Behind the Sims about sim precision and how like some of that is personal preference. And
yes,
you know, you might want to have a more diversified style of play, or you might want to have a less diversified style of play, and like sim precision can give you that without you know, necessarily like hurting your EV too much. It's like just sort of how much risk do you want to take on. And again, there's nothing wrong with like forcing stacks if that's what you really want. So anyway, basically just saying like these, I think this is a really big improvement. And I think it's like, I think a lot of people are just going to like roll with these. I think that's a good idea, but don't feel like you suddenly can't do anything to like differentiate. This is just kind of, we're constantly improving this process and like learning and trying to just like make it better and better. So like by default, you can get good lineups, but it's always like a process, not like the final result. So
yeah, I think that's well said. And I think one thing that's really cool about the way we did this project, something we talked about in earlier episodes of Behind the Sims here with this series, is we have established a bit of a framework here for us to do this in the future. We talked about NFL coming up and other sports and MLB 2023. We have I would say a better workflow to just do continued slider backtesting now in the future that we can kind of point to. This is how we do it. So I guess to the point I'm trying to make there is this isn't final. This isn't the last time we're going to probably change the sliders or come up with a better way to do that. So but with that, Matt, I'll let you go ahead and get out of here. I know you have many wonderful new SaberSim features to keep building. So I'll let you get back to that, and I will stick around here and answer any other questions, other things here from everybody watching. So thanks again for coming on, and appreciate all the hard work you did on this, because I think it's a big improvement here.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me.
All right. See ya. All right, cool. Well, let's keep it going here, guys. I know there are a ton of other questions in the queue here, but just about other SaberSim things here. So we will just keep it rolling. I'm going to do my best to make sure that I'm getting to these questions, I would say, in about the order that they came in here. So let me go ahead. And we'll just back all the way up to a question that came in last night from KG here. And this question says, thanks for the answer to my question on the stream yesterday. Just finished watching it. Following up regarding ownership, I got it right with Freed tonight, but landed on too much Kirby. Went back to step one after noticing not enough Valdez in my pool. How much ownership for one player versus exposure? Example, field owned Valdez 11%. If I match that, am I exposing myself too much to a pitcher on FanDuel following the profit plan? Yeah, so this is a pretty nuanced question. I wouldn't say that there's necessarily like one size fits all of this is exactly how much to exposure to get to this player or that player, or every time you do this. I would say, especially if you're playing a large number of unique lineups like you are in this particular case, I think one easy way, a way to simplify this for yourself while you are getting a little bit more familiar with how you want to handle this on very specific cases, is to break things down into like 3 kind of break points. And to basically say, if I really like a player, I want to get 2x the field at least on that player. If I'm trying to fade a player, I'm going to make sure I'm no more than half the field exposed. And if I'm kind of neutral on a player, I'm going to try to match the field exposure. So you mentioned Valdez 11%. We can use the example here tonight. Let's say we were playing 150 and this was our lineup pool. And we had decided that one of our stands was that we wanted to fade DeGrom, right, against the Dodgers or something like that. Well, how much exposure should we get to DeGrom? Again, that's a complicated question that has a lot to do with your own personal risk tolerance. But if you're unsure what even your own personal risk tolerance is, I think a decent baseline would be saying, I'm going to get half of the field. I'm going to get to half of the field, my exposure to DeGrom there. And what you're doing there is you're basically saying your average lineup from your portfolio stands to benefit more than the average lineup from the field should DeGrom end up not having a good game, something like that. So I think using those heuristics of saying 2x the field, 1/2 the field, or even with the field, depending on how you like or dislike a particular player, is a good idea. So, again, just going back to your example, if you had decided you liked Valdez, you wanted some Valdez, and he was 11% owned on FanDuel last night, I think a good baseline of how much exposure to try to get to, at least as a starting point, would be 22% or so, using that heuristic. So, good question there. I'll hit this one from Callie. I think we did a pretty good job discussing this question with Matt on just a moment ago. But this question says, could you go over the sim precision slider? What does it do when you move it up? What does it do when you move it down? And is it a good idea to move it up or down in a small slate in MLB? So yeah, what the sim precision slider does is it basically controls how many simulations are we looking at to build each individual lineup, right? So we have average projections on SaberSim, but we do not have only average projections. We have full play-by-play game sims of every game on the slate. So we may say DeGrom's average projection is 23.37, but we have a full, complete range of outcomes of all of the different ways that game can play out. And when we build lineups, we don't just build purely based on the average. We build using those buckets of simulations. So when you are building your lineups on SaberSim and your sim precision slider is determining how many simulations are you going to look at on a per lineup basis, right? So sim precision 6 will say 18 sims per lineup. We're going to take 18 random sims of each game and then build the best possible lineup around those sims. And sim precision 3 will be, we're going to take 64 sims per lineup and build the best set of lineups around those particular outcomes. So as you move this up, you are looking at fewer sims per lineup, which increases your volatility and diversity. As it goes down, you are getting closer to the average projections by looking at bigger buckets of sims per lineup. In terms of should you adjust it, I would argue, especially, following this project that we just completed, I think this is probably the time where I'm least likely to be making adjustments to the sliders, right? Because we just re-back tested them. I would say you would probably be better off just selecting the right contest that you are playing. So if it's a small slate, that will automatically be adjusted. If it's a small contest, right, tell us what contest size it is. If it's a large field contest, tell us what contest it is. But I think, especially right now, given the fact that we just did this slider backtesting project, I think now is probably the best time to be a little bit more confident in the sliders and to make fewer adjustments. Okay, cool. Nipsey had asked a question about making adjustments pre-build versus post-build. I'm going to read this question. I think Shady Advice has a very eloquent answer to this, so I'm going to read that aloud as well. He said, with a lot of the discussion of the process being devoted to post-build, just feel like the pre-build part of the process is not getting its proper attention because it's the individual player will have the most input and then let the sims have at it. What are your thoughts? How much is pre-build apart from your process? By the way, great work. Yeah, I'm going to just read this answer because I think this answer from Shady Advice is really good. He said, I tend to think of adjustments to step 1 or to the projections, the inputs, as making a statement that I know more about a player than people whose job it is to build the projections about that player. Whereas in steps 3 are just me saying that I know more about my risk tolerances than they do. I think the second is more likely to occur than the first. And I think not to say that there is no value that can be added in the projections. Of course there is. No model is perfect, but I think it's a really good approach that unless you are incredibly opinionated or confident about a change to a projection or to a team or to an ownership projection, the reason we focus so much on talking about post-build adjustments is because they are adjustments that are made to an unopinionated pool, is the way I think about it, right? You're building 1,500 lineups with what is like the default values of models that we work very hard to perfect. From there, you can be opinionated in your own way about your risk tolerance and strategic decisions you want to make there. I think that is why there is such an emphasis on the post-build part of the process overall. So, yeah, good question. Very good answer from Shady Advice. And let's keep it going. There's a question from Six Fever here as well about our contest selection videos. He said, hey, are you doing NFL, MLB, NBA for FanDuel contest selection anytime soon? If I missed that, is there a video on it? Thank you. At the very top of our YouTube channel here, or I guess not the very top, in this new here section, start winning more with our DFS profit plan. This is our most recent contest selection video. This video is intended to provide a framework, right? Essentially a strategy for contest selection that should be applicable no matter what sport you're talking about, no matter what site you're talking about. In that video, I focus on MLB because we recorded that video during MLB season, but you should be able to use that for FanDuel football, for example, and basically say, what are the steps to do this? And then let me execute the steps on that contest selection lobby. With that said, I think the goal in the future is I'll probably put out a video for football where I demo this and basically say, hey, I'm using the framework from this video. Let me just show you how I do it. Maybe we'll do that on an office hours stream sometime. I think that actually maybe would be a better idea. But you should be able to apply the concepts from this video to any sport, any site. So, okay. B-Rad has a question here. And B-Rad, I hope you are still sticking around. I noticed that you said this is your day 3 of SaberSim. So I apologize. You caught us on a day here where we were doing kind of an interview show. Typically Monday through Friday, 2:00 Eastern. This show is just straight up open Q&A where I'll answer questions. But we had Matt on today talking about the sliders. But anyway, he said, at what point do you start limiting exposure or changing the ownership fade? Not the first build, obviously, day three of using this. So I would say, I would say adjusting your exposure in the post-build process is one of the highest value things that you can do within SaberSim, and something that you could basically start doing on day 1, right? If you feel so inclined, right? I mean, if this is your very first build you've ever built on SaberSim and you're looking at this and you think being under on DeGrom makes you nervous and that feels like a bad idea, you can go ahead and get 70% exposure to DeGrom. What happens is we sort through this pool of 500 lineups to find the best 150 in this case that match the exposures you've requested, right? So you're sorting through this set of very viable lineups and filtering through a set of 150 that has the right exposures at different stack types, different teams, different players, and so on. So you can start doing that immediately, right? I think that's probably actually like once you've built your first lineups and feel comfortable with like literally the how to use the tool, I think that's probably the very first thing I would recommend somebody start looking at is what are your exposures and what adjustments do you want to make there? I probably wouldn't mess around with the sliders very much right now, especially as somebody newer to SaberSim and given that we just spent a lot of work to backtest them. I don't really think adjustments to the sliders are something that you like graduate to, right? Like I wouldn't say it's as if once you get the exposures, then you start adjusting the sliders. I think in fact, actually making adjustments to the sliders is just kind of a lower value thing to do in SaberSim overall. Like most of the time I just use the defaults. I don't really make a lot of changes to my sliders, period. But adjusting exposures, yes, a very, very high value thing that I definitely recommend doing. So Carry Out Cole had asked a good question here and said, do you adjust the precision slider when doing late swap? I feel like I should be lowering it because there are fewer players to choose from. And you would think fewer good plays. Thoughts? Yeah. So for baseball, first of all, I'm gonna call out another video here. I have a video up on our YouTube channel, how to late swap an MLB DFS. the way I like recommend optimally late swapping for baseball is covered in that video. I actually like to lean on the quick swap tool a little bit more than the late swap tool for baseball, just because of the way baseball late swaps tend to end up playing out. With that said, if you are running a true like late swap build here, I do generally like the idea, or at least like the idea of considering to turn down the sim precision slider a bit when running a late swap build, maybe like 1 or 2 notches. The reason for that is actually less, I would say, about necessarily there being fewer good players to choose from, and more about the fact that when you run a late swap build on SaberSim, we don't have the lineup pool anymore. Each lineup only gets rebuilt one time, and because you're introducing a little bit more variance in the form of how that lineup might get rebuilt just when it's rebuilt one single time, I like to kind of counteract that and balance that out by using a slightly lower sim precision. That's kind of more of a software. That's more of a product question for us. In the future, we're planning on actually building out a late swap pool, which will solve that issue. So in other words, I don't think there's like a DFS theory reason to turn sim precision down, but because of that particular like product limitation for now, I like to turn it down a little bit to counteract some of that natural variance there. So Nipsey asks, can you discuss how and when SaberScore gets attached to a lineup? It is attached, I guess, to use your words here, after all the lineups are made, basically. So the pool of 500 lineups is created, and then each lineup is graded using a SaberScore. It's assigned a SaberScore. How it is essentially, SaberScore is essentially quantifying how well did that lineup meet the parameters established by the sliders, right? When we say, for this build, we built this on 5-4-7, right? Correlation high, ownership fade moderate, sim precision high, right? This is basically saying by that metric, by this rubric, how well did each lineup, how good is each lineup? How well did each lineup do that, right? So that's kind of where that comes from, is essentially SaberScore there. It is an alternative to sorting purely by projected score, right? Projected score does not take into account upside, does not take into account ownership, it does not take into account correlation. SaberScore takes into account all three. It is basically grading a lineup by saying how well did this lineup do those things. So, all right, cool. Let's see. Let me hop back over to YouTube chat. There were a couple other questions. Skull had asked earlier, when lineups are being built, how is it using the 95th percentile or even 99th percentile projections, or how is upside calculated for each player? Yeah, so it's using neither, right? It's not using a percentile. What it is based on your sim precision slider, right? It is taking a bucket, a set of sims, and using what the player scored in that sim bucket as the baseline projections, right? So, you might get even though DeGrom's average projection across all sims is 22.3, and even though his 95th percentile is, let's see, is, whoops. Where is it? Oh, come on. His 95th percentile is 39.4. Your bucket of 11 sims that ended up being used to make this lineup, for example, he might have scored 36.4 on average across that bucket, right? So, the idea here is that we're pulling. The reason that people don't just optimize for average projections in a nutshell is because players don't always score their averages, right? They have some distribution associated with what they can actually score. We are sampling from that distribution as we have determined it by simulating out every game on a per lineup basis. Each lineup is getting a different subsample of that actual true distribution of how that player could score. And the size of that subsample, how many sims we're looking at on a per lineup basis, is what sim precision quantifies. So Skull said, to expand on my question, say two players have projections and ownership were the exact same, but one of those players' 95th percentile was 2 points higher. Does SaberSim take that into consideration in the lineup pool? Yes, to the extent of which that player's distribution looks better on the upside than the other player. The player with the higher 95th percentile outcome has more sims where they score more points, where they score a higher ceiling. So over a large run of lineups, you will get more of the player that has the higher upside. That doesn't necessarily mean you will get 100% of the player with the higher 95th percentile and 0% of the player with the lower 95th percentile. So Deshaun says, so to get more random low-owned players in your lineups, would you just up the sim precision and not do anything with the fade slider? This is a tough question. I would say a higher sim precision slider is likely to get you onto lower-owned plays naturally because of the fact that you're looking at a wider range of outcomes for each player. So you'll get there. That will be the effect of that. I would say if you are particularly looking to try to get lower owned lineups, a more direct route to doing that might be to just increase the ownership fade, because it's going to directly get you to lower owned lineups, or alternatively to just make adjustments to player exposures to, fade the higher owned plays more in your lineup portfolio. But I mean, yes, increasing the sim precision slider is likely to get you onto lower owned plays anyway. So, Eric asked about Lance Lynn. I have no idea. I think he was supposed to pitch today. It seems like maybe now he's out. We'll see when it gets a little bit closer to lock. Orlando said, when is Superdraft coming? For what sports? Honestly, it's something that is on our roadmap. I think our focus right now is going to be on the big three and really even the big two of DraftKings and FanDuel. I think adding support to other sites is something that we do want to do, but there are so many awesome product features that we want to bring to you guys first. Many of which I've talked about here on the stream before, that I frankly can't say that it is a priority for us to get Superdraft support up. I think it is something that we want to do, but there are product features, things that we can do to just make your DFS lineups better that we want to knock out first. So, DG, I think I missed this question. We covered this a fair bit when Matt was on here. He said, what were the sliders tested on? Winning lineups, winners lineups, the highest scoring lineups. I don't remember. So what it actually was, it was what lineup settings built your pool, your 500 lineup pool, with the highest overall omega ratio. And what omega ratio is it is a ratio of how much do you win when you win, divided by how much do you lose when you lose. It's essentially a ratio that's designed to balance upside with risk. And the way we calculated those out was our own sims of contests, basically. So we would basically build a set of 500 lineups and then run it through a simulation of the contests those lineups were hypothetically entered into. And the sliders were set to the build settings that delivered the highest overall omega ratios. So it's not heuristically done. It was not done by looking at winning lineups or by looking at winner proven profitable players and trying to back out the slider settings from that. It was actually literally, these are the proven slider settings based on that sim. So, Eric, we touched on this question, but I don't think we actually directly answered it. It said, when playing in something like the FanDuel Live Final, would you run a satellite build or a GPP build, since it's basically a big winner take all? I think as a baseline, the satellite settings are a good place to start for a contest like that. It would be something like this, right? I don't think it's actually a proper 20 max, maybe a 3 max is, I think it's an 8 max, right? Is actually what it is. Something like this would probably be a good baseline from which to work from for a FanDuel Live Final or any Live Final. So, cool. Spastic Toaster said, when are you expecting to release larger build pools? When it's ready. I don't have an estimated date. So we are still building out that and other features, and we will bring it to you guys as quickly as it is ready, basically. Svada said, is Statcast data used to come up with projections? Statcast data is not a direct input to our sims. This was brought up as well on our stream we did at the start of the season with the models team. It is not a direct input there. So if there is information buried in Statcast data that you think has value and is predictive and is useful, I think it could be a potential thing to look at and make some adjustments, but it is not a direct input. So, okay, let me see. I think we are about caught up here. Let me double check and make sure that I got to everything here. I think there was another question that had come in. If you guys have any other questions for me here, fire away at me now, and we'll get to them here. Let me go ahead. Okay, so there was a question. Get this pulled up here. This was from CJ. This came in via email, and let's see. So this was a question from here. Let me just pull this up. Did that work? Huh. Okay. I won't be able to pull up the exact picture that was sent along with this particular question here. But I will paste the question in and we'll answer this for CJ. Sorry, hang on. Just give me a second here. Okay. This question says, I do have a question on how to optimize lineups at the start of regular NFL season. As I'm drafting this email, I have my browser open. I'm building lineups for the September 8th Thursday night slate. My number one ranked lineup is shown below. I will just tell you guys what it is. It's Cooper Kupp captain, Stafford, Singletary, Duke Johnson, Cam Akers, and James Cook. And the question says, I've watched your videos enough to know how SaberSim considers ownership, projections, etc. However, I'm curious to know how that works on day 0 with no previous data to work from. For example, as shown in the screenshot, why would SaberSim choose to add Duke Johnson, who's no longer on the team, and James Cook, the third on the Buffalo depth chart, over Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs to the number 1 ranked lineup? I'm just trying to better understand the logic behind the interface. Okay, I mean, first, simple answer, our week 1 projections are up as kind of mostly something to play around with and explore, rather than, I would say, something to be using to like enter your final lineups. Obviously, there will be new simulations that run for every game on the slate to account for the final 53-man rosters and things like that. They're mostly just up there right now to play with, right? We will certainly not have players that are not on the active roster be showing up in your lineups when it comes time, Wednesday of next week, Thursday of next week, to actually build these lineups. I mean, I also will mention, it would be very nice if on a per lineup basis, we could replace Duke Johnson and James Cook with Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs. The reason Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs are not in that lineup is because there's a lot of salary tied up with Cooper Kupp captain, Matt Stafford, Devin Singletary, and Cam Akers, who are already in the lineup, right? You can't necessarily just take Duke Johnson and James Cook out and plug Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs in, right? Ultimately, these questions come up frequently in football season where I'll get a question from somebody that says, hey, got this lineup, explain it to me. And that's a difficult question to answer because the explanation is always the same. For Showdown, what is happening here is every single one of your lineups is going to be basically an optimal for a single game sim of the way that game could play out, right? So if you're seeing a lineup that has, Josh Allen, but the Rams defense, Jordan, how does that make sense? Well, it doesn't happen frequently, but there are game simulations where both Josh Allen captain and the Rams defense are optimal. Part of the value add that I think you can do to your lineups on SaberSim after those lineups are built, and part of the reason why we build 500 lineups, even if you only need 20, is to allow for some of that quality control and adjustments that you can make in the post-build process. If you see a lineup in your portfolio that you don't like, you can eliminate it, right? That is why the portfolio exists. If there is a particular player that you just simply want none of, you can eliminate all lineups with those players. If you see a lineup that you would really like, if only one other player was different than what you actually see, you can edit that lineup, right? If we're looking at this and you think, I like all of this except for James Cook, for example, right? You can come in here and put somebody else in instead, right? Maybe it is Isaiah McKenzie. I don't know, just as a hypothetical, right? And now that lineup has Isaiah McKenzie, and you can do that instead. This is probably one of the harder questions that I get on this stream. Explain this lineup to me. What your lineup is always a subset of simulations. It is based on a subset of sims. In the case of Showdown, a single sim, and then adjusted accordingly based on ownership and correlation. And in this case, there is no correlation or ownership, right? They are just single sim optimals. So I would feel confident eliminating lineups that you don't want to play, editing lineups that you want to make different, changing your player exposures until you're comfortable with the portfolio of lineups you have, because that's why we build 500, is to allow you to do things like that. So, and one final note that all of our week 1 projections are basically our first draft. We're still, I know there's a lot of football excitement. We're still over a week away. Things will continue to dial in and finalize as we approach next week. So, okay. And then let's see, another question here. In email, let me get this one pulled up. Actually, we had already talked about that one. So, let me get to one other one here. And again, post any questions you guys have in YouTube chat or the Office Hours channel in Slack. We are almost through the questions here. This one was from Gordon about tennis. Said another note, have you made any adjustments to the tennis sliders? Still trying to figure out if tennis is viable. I don't know if tennis has been really updated based on this project. I would say there's not, so for tennis and MMA and Showdown as well, there's not a lot of changes to be made here, mostly because what the sliders are basically saying. The only correlation in tennis is between opposing players in the same match. And since we generally don't even have that toggle on, it doesn't really matter. The sliders are essentially 1 ownership fade and 10 sim precision for most of these. It is basically saying take a single slate optimal, basically sim every match once and take the optimal lineup you can build, slightly adjusted for ownership, and then that is your lineup portfolio. That's also the same way MMA and Showdowns and things like that are calculated. I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I would feel pretty confident that those are the right sliders to use based on the way that tennis typically plays out. Maybe on a very, very large slate, there's an argument to bring down the sim precision slider just a tad. But because dupes are such a concern in tennis DFS, or at least something to be considering, I probably wouldn't go too low on sim precision. So in terms of trying to figure out if tennis is viable, our subscribers have had a ton of success playing tennis DFS since our new sims came out. So I would definitely at least give it a shot if it's a sport you're interested in. I think we have a very strong model and a very good simulator for tennis. I also think what is out there in the industry, what other tennis tools are available, we're just head and shoulders above that. So I think you can get a huge edge from people. I mean, a lot of some of the other even big DFS sites don't even really have tennis projections. And from there, if they do, you're using just an average traditional optimizer to try to account for the variance and things like that. And I think it just gets very hard very fast. So I think tennis is definitely viable. I would at least, you can start small. The $1.20 max. There's a $1.20 max for every tennis slate. I think that's a nice low stakes entry point to start playing tennis DFS. So, all right, cool. I think we're all caught up. I don't see any other questions. I may have missed one. I don't see any other questions that have come in, but I think we've done a pretty good job, both from talking when Matt was on here and into this impromptu office hours Q&A segment here after. I think we've caught all the questions. So I think with that, we will leave it right there for today. I will be right back here again tomorrow, 2:00 Eastern, for normal office hours, open Q&A. In the meantime, enjoy the 9-gamer here tonight. We didn't even really talk about the baseball slate here tonight at all, which I think makes some sense, but it is an interesting one. You have a really, really top-heavy pitching pool here. With DeGrom and Cole both on the slate. DeGrom facing the Dodgers, which is an interesting matchup there. I think Lance Lynn will be the de facto cheaper option that is often paired there. And then you have a ton of other really bad pitchers. Like almost every other game, the pitching is kind of rough. So you will have, there are a lot of different other teams to stack. There are a lot of other kind of offenses to get to. I think it'll be an interesting slate here tonight. I think it's a fun one. I can't say for certain what I will end up doing here, but I will say just if I were my almost just gut check impression here about the slate is that, and it depends a lot on if Lynn's actually playing. I'm not sure if he actually is, but I think I will probably be over on DeGrom and Cole because it is a rare slate indeed where you can get these guys at even these ownership projections. And I think I will probably get under on Lance Lynn, depending, again, I'm not making promises here, but under on Lance Lynn and hope that, other guys that I think are closer to that expectation there with a much lower ownership pay off. And then probably be pretty diversified across all of these different hitting options and stacks. That is my gut check reaction, having built almost no builds for today of how I think I will likely want to play this, but we'll see. Anyway, enjoy this slate here tonight. I will see you guys all again tomorrow, 2:00 Eastern. And